Archaeology are very much very wide. They deal with things like the history of beds, which was a fascinating topic, which for some reason was very popular in France, and water, climate change, and North American archaeology. Those started off as an Africanist. That was where I began, and I was taken on by the Livingstone Museum in Zambia way back in 1959 to study the Iron Age of Central and Southern Africa. And for the next 7 years, I did nothing else. And I thought it would be rather fun because a lot of people don't know much about this sort of archaeology, that I would talk about the Indian Ocean world and the whole question of trade with the far interior of Africa that would be inland from Raptor on the map. This is a story of sailing ships, of wind, of trade routes, of different commodities, and of powerful chiefs in the far interior of Southern Africa. So without further ado, let's look at the next picture, please, Jacob. Next, please. Hello?
Okay.
Next slide.
Oh, all right. I already did it, but for some reason it's sorry. Give me
You
a
have a
moment.
next slide on?
Yeah. But,
You do. Oh, it's me being stupid. Sorry.
no.
Oh no, I don't know if this.
It's
Just put me up. Put it up. I can cope. Don't worry.
all right.
Okay, I'll keep going. Don't worry.
Can you see now?
And okay, and then the whole story here begins with the discovery, and if discovery is the right word, of the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. According to written records, they were first discovered by Greek and Egyptian navigators in Alexandria in about 120 BC, when a traveler called Hippalus and a skipper called Euxodus traveled from the Red Sea to India and back using favorable winds. These, of course, are the monsoon winds, which are traditionally known very well. But in those days, the only people who knew about them were the navigators of Arab descent and those living in India who made use of them, but kept their mouths shut. They didn't talk to the people of the Red Sea much about this, although people were well aware that you did travel as far as India. The monsoon winds are particularly interesting because they are the, next slide, please. They are the winds which for some time in November to February blow from the northeast to the southwest. This means that ships can sail from India or indeed from the Bay of Bengal all the way to Africa and take their time on it. These northeasterly winds are generally fairly light. Then in April, the wind changes and you can sail from Africa to India and beyond with strong southwesterly monsoon. And the rhythm of life on these coastal places, which you see in the map there, was dedicated for centuries, dictated by the monsoon winds and the cycles of the monsoon winds. The great thing about monsoon winds, and I'm a sailor, is that they are reliable. They come and they go. They may get stronger, they may get weaker, but you can predict when they will blow. And this was the trade, the force, which drove centuries of trade between the Red Sea and the west coast of India, and between the west coast of India, Arabia, and the East African coast, which was known as Azania. And we know about this because of an anonymous author. We think he was an Alexandrian Greek, we're not sure, who wrote a book with the magnificent title of The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The Erythraean Sea is the Red Sea, which is, of course, what we call the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And this gentleman, he was probably a man, was an expert traveler and navigator. He really got his hands dirty, and it's quite clear because what he did was to write a description of the ports of the Indian Ocean coast, all the way from the mouth of the Indus, where he complained about sea snakes, to the Arabian coast, which is desert and inhospitable, down the East African coast into Azania. And each place he had kind of snapshots of what it was like to live there, what the people were like. For example, he talked about boats on the East African coast, which were sewn together. And he described also ancient trade in ivory with the African interior. And once Greece and the Mediterranean powers had discovered the monsoon winds, a regular trade every year between India and the Red Sea, and eventually with the East African coast, developed and continued right up to the Portuguese arrival in 1497 and right into modern times. I have myself seen the dhows leaving the coast at Malindi with drums and trumpets and noise and dancing at the beginning of the monsoon winds. And of course, when they were coming back, was eagerly awaited. And this is, next please, is an extraordinarily interesting piece of history, little known, because what is not known much outside the African world is that Arabian navigators were extraordinarily good and skilled, and like the Polynesians, they used the movements of the heavenly bodies to find their way across the Indian Ocean. The thing about the monsoons, and this is the vital thing that really drives the whole of this trade, was the fact that it was possible to go from India to the East African coast and back in the course of a 12-month year. So you could get a trade which was reliable in both directions. And one of the places which was a major center for this was the island of Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea, which is famous for its spices. And it was a major entrepot of spices. And there also, there were people with camels who traded the spices across the island. So this was one spot, and it was from here and from the mouth of the Red Sea that people sailed southwards to Azania, the East African coast, today Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Next, please. How did they do this? How did they sail? Well, here are some challenges of the coast. You can see here the coast of the Hadramaut, very dry, very rugged, only water in very few places, relatively few places where you could anchor. Of course, one of them was Aden, which was a major port. Very tough, hot coast with not a great deal of wind. But during the northeast monsoon, the dhows, which is what these boats were called, could sail up this coast, and they would tack against the wind really slowly with these huge mainsails pulled in tightly. And they would come within a few hundred yards of the beach, then tack and move inshore in an ancient navigation route, which was known intimately by the dhow skippers of the day. Here's one of the anchorages where they could anchor, very exposed, except for wind from the northeast. Very desertic, as you can see in the middle. And at the far end, there was the Indus River, where the sea serpents flourished, a very tricky entrance, and of course the river rises in the Himalayas. But inland, everything went by camel or on the back of human beings. It was a trade on the ocean and the land. Next, please. There was a complicated history of sailing boats in the Indian Ocean. The most famous of these is the Lateen rigged dhow. And we're terribly lucky because back in the late 1930s, an Australian writer and sailor called Alan Villiers, who was a brilliant writer and a very good sailor. He was one of the last people to sail full-rigged ships. And he wrote a magnificent book on a year he spent in the Indian Ocean traveling on this dhow. And he described the rhythm of the monsoon winds, the East African coast, the people. At times there were 50 or 60 people traveling as passengers on this boat. He had mistresses in practically every port, the skipper, not Villiers. And we get an absolutely unrivaled view of what this trade must have been like. And one of the cargoes they carried, oddly enough, were mangrove poles from mangrove swamps on the East African coast, because there was no wood in Arabia. And this trade in poles was of enormous value to the Arabians. And he described in particular the trade where you go close inland. And he also described the bargaining, the politics, and everything. If you come across a copy of this book, it is a fabulous read. The name of the man is Alan Villiers, and the book is called Sons of Sinbad. It really is, it's in print, it really is a lovely book. And he described particularly the coast of Azania. Next, please. And here we meet one of the other players in this complicated story. The dhows would arrive at well-established stopping places. Some were little more than anchorages. Others were towns built of cement made of coral. You can see one of them. The most famous is Lamu, which even today is still an extremely traditional city in northern Kenya. It's a small place, and the streets are so narrow that you have donkeys that travel down them, not not motor cars. And it's a sheltered anchorage, and the dhows will anchor off the town or even come alongside and unload. If ever you have a chance to go to Lamu in northern Kenya, go. It is worth every moment of it, because you really get an evocative sense of a now long vanished trade. Next, please. This coast, you can see a very nice picture up in the top right, is marked by offshore reefs. You can see them here. There's a channel through it. And you anchor, if you can, inside the reef, or you go to the larger ports like Malindi here, down bottom right, or Mombasa at top left, which now is a large coastal port, an important harbor, and the entrance to the harbor is, you can see in the background. This is the famous Portuguese fort, which was built here by the Portuguese because they realized this was a most important stepping off point for trade across the Indian Ocean. Many of the local boats are very narrow. They have outriggers, like you can see here. No one knows where they originated, but they're absolutely ideal for sailing through the reefs. And you will see them today, even in the era of outboard motors. And this coast, they sailed down all the way down to about the latitude of Madagascar. Next, please. Next, please. I don't have it. Next, please. There we go. And the most southerly significant town is a place called Kilwa in southern Tanzania. It was built in about 1350, a little earlier, before the Portuguese arrived. The earliest stone towns date to about 900 AD, and Islam arrived there in about 1000, and these towns all have mosques. They at least had a nominal allegiance to Islam. This is the famous mosque at Islam with its domed roof. Here is part of the town. And the anchorage is here, and it was here, was the most southern point, probably, that the big dhows came. Now, the important thing about these stone towns were that they were all centered on the coast. They were all ruled by different chiefs who were Arabs, Africans. These were African towns, and the hinterland inside with its clay and thatched houses, huts, was an African area. This was a trade from Africa controlled by Africans. There were, of course, people from Arabia who lived here, but it was always a place where Africans had a very important role to play. Next, please. What did they trade? These dhows, you can see one at the bottom, had a number of very important staples. What is not generally known, again, in so much of this history, it's a tragedy, people don't know about it, was in gold. And what is not generally known is that until about the 15th century, 2/3 of Europe's gold came from the Malian kingdom in West Africa. You can see the king of Mali there, a European depiction of him, obviously. But the trade in Southern Africa started off in ivory. There is an elephant. Golden rule of travel in Africa. If you were in a Land Rover or equivalent on a narrow bush road and encounter an elephant, know how to go in reverse at 40 miles an hour. However, let us not get into that. They were carried, these trunks, to the coast, because the critical thing about the East African coast and the interior was the fact that the rivers are not navigable for long distances. So everything had to be carried on the backs of people. And of course, this raised the issue of slavery. This is a 19th century depiction here, a photograph. And in the center there is a cross African ingot. This one, notice how it's shaped. You could jam them or lash them onto poles and people could carry them in pairs. Or they would bring gold to the coast either in dust or in beads. Why? Because it was very easily portable, especially the dust, which was put into, believe it or not, porcupine quills, which of course are light and portable. Everything was light and portable. Next, please. The other items in the trade are easily enumerated, many of them carried by smaller dhows like this from one post to another. The big dhows were the ocean ones. These are the coastal ones. This is a particularly vivid picture taken during the southwest monsoon when the wind was stronger. What did they take into the interior? The answer is things that were portable. Down bottom left, cowrie shells, valued as hair ornaments. In the middle, conus shells. The bottoms here, you can see one, the top sawn off, were so valuable because they were remembered as or considered symbols of chieftainship, of power. And in the 19th century, they were still trading them. And the missionary David Livingstone recorded in Angola, in Central Africa, hundreds of miles from the East African coast, that just one of these shells would get you an ivory tusk or a slave. And the other big trade was in textiles from India, where there were expert weavers. and also in glass beads, beads from all sorts of places, Venice, Iran, and India, different colors, and they were traded again in strings. The only problem with all this trade was that bead colors and the fashions changed literally overnight. And sometimes you would arrive with thousands of, say, red beads and found that people were no longer interested in red beads. So it was a very volatile trade, and the whole trade, and this is an important thing about the whole of the African trade, depended on personal contacts with different individuals. And individual contacts and greetings and relationships and obligations made this trade work, which covered hundreds of miles of very remote and also very demanding territory. Let's have a look at it. Next picture. The main access routes to the interior were from the mouth of the Zambezi up to the plateau, which you can see here, the darker area in what is now Zimbabwe. And there were the southern limit, really, of this was the Limpopo River, the northern boundary of South Africa. The coast up here, the highlands, were relatively fertile, and they were ideal for cattle because there were no tsetse flies, and also there were extensive deposits of gold. And this is what made the trade work. In one way, ivory, gold, and other raw materials, even iron ore. The other way, up came seashells, bundles of textiles, and all kinds of weird things, which we'll look at in a moment. The two great rivers, of course, are iconic. Here at the bottom are two pictures of the Limpopo River, which is a very arid area today. These were taken when there was higher rainfall. And the other was the Zambezi. Zambezi, of course, is famous for the Victoria Falls. It is an area where the river is a mile wide, and the whole river falls dramatically into this gorge, bringing up enormous clouds of fine spray, which are visible from many miles away. And then the gorge zigzags down for about 100 miles and ends up in the middle Zambezi Valley, which is low, and we will look at it in a moment. The Zambezi Valley is famous for its game, particularly its elephants, as the Zambezi is, as the Limpopo is. This was taken on the Limpopo. And of course, for its lions. Have you ever, dear listener, camped on the river and heard on the other bank lions roaring at the full moon? You ain't lived until you've done that, particularly if you're safe from them jumping on you in the middle of the night. It is a spectacular area. It's hot, humid, and very difficult for travel, but the game is extraordinary. Next, please. And this was the country where people traded. There's another view of the Limpopo, actually a tributary of it. You can see the very rugged terrain. The big problem with traveling here is finding your way away from the rivers, which was why paths between different villages were of enormous importance. Local knowledge, guides, but the whole thing depended, except down at the very bottom of the river, down by the ocean, depended on people carrying things. There weren't domestic oxen, there weren't donkeys, it was on your backs. Next, please. The Limpopo Valley was the center of a series of kingdoms, all of them at the time depending on agriculture and particularly on cattle. This was a very volatile area between about 12 and 1300 AD. The first farmers arrived in Southern Africa about 2,000 years ago. These were subsistence farmers. They bought cattle, they cultivated a range of African cereals, and they were basically egalitarian, small-scale societies which were thin on the ground at first. They also were very careful where they selected the soils. But in time, they became much more organized, social complexity became increased, and the reason for this probably was an increase in the use of cattle as wealth. Cattle and wealth had enormous value in these ancient societies as a way of bargaining, as a symbol of power, and for bride wealth. And the kingdoms that arose around Mapungubwe and also further north at Great Zimbabwe were based very heavily on the notion that cattle were wealth. And the chiefs who controlled these cattle kingdoms were powerful, they were ritually important, and they also traded in gold and ivory, very much as a sort of part-time thing, but it brought them great power and wealth because with the imports they had of glass beads, of textiles and so on, they were able to reward loyal followers. And the whole thing was a sort of complicated relationships of reciprocity, of exchange, of personal relationships, which meant that this was very volatile and the loyalty of the people you governed was of critical importance. This is Mapungubwe Hill, the Hill of the Jackal, the most famous of these kingdoms. The kingdom itself was in a large settlement down here, which has been excavated, was a big cattle village, basically. But up here lived the chiefs, the elite, in isolation. Why? Because one of their skills was that of rainmaking. And they lived here in isolation. Next, please. And here are some of these people. They were cattle people. They herded mostly shorthorn, sometimes longhorned animals. Here's one of the chiefs, a 19th century picture. He doesn't look very imposing until you see the ornaments he's wearing and hear him talk. When he talked, people were quiet. Why? Because he had enormous ritual power and political power. And much of what he's wearing were imported beads. Here is a more modern version of them. But cattle were the governing thing here, although trade was increasingly important. But eventually, this was a very volatile kingdom, and a period of, say, 10 years of drought would mean that people's cattle would perish, and those who had more rainfall would acquire more beasts, more power, and so on. It was a very volatile situation, which we've barely begun to understand. Next, please. Here are some of the gold items they had. This rhinoceros made of gold sheet, probably owned by the principal chief, the tip of a scepter, and a gold bowl. These, in this society, were items not only of value, but of enormous chiefly and ritual significance. What the significance was ritually, of course, we do not know. Next, please. And now we come to the next chapter. And this chapter ultimately was dominated by this dreadful gentleman, Cecil Jane Rhodes, the ultimate vicious, nasty imperialist. And the site upon which he put his hands or his eyes was Africa's iconic site, Great Zimbabwe. Next, please. Great Zimbabwe was, to the north. It's in sort of south central Zimbabwe today. The country is named after the ruins. And it was the place where the main political and economic influence moved to the north, largely because at the time, Great Zimbabwe was in an area with superb grazing. You can see some of it here, taken at a period when there was higher rainfall than today. And it was here that great chiefs, they were known as mutapas, built the ruins, which are ruins today, of their headquarters, the center of what was an extensive cattle kingdom. Probably about 20,000 people were involved in the kingdom as a minimum. It was first encountered by European explorers in 1890, and it was found by a prospector, and he was amazed at these freestanding stone walls, which at the time were all covered with vegetation. And he announced that he had discovered the palace of the biblical Queen of Sheba. Of course, the white settlers loved this. This was meat and drink to them because it justified their grabbing of the gold mines, the colonization of what became southern Rhodesia. In fact, the archaeologists were on the scene very early. They commissioned by Cecil John Rhodes initially to prove that this was a Phoenician settlement. But to the annoyance of Bent and others, of Rhodes and others, they discovered it wasn't. And they found clay, Chinese pottery and other things which suggested it was only of medieval date. And furious arguments to the point where no more excavation was carried out there till 1929, when the lady down at the bottom right, Gertrude Caton-Thompson, came here at the commissioned by the British Association for the Advancement of Science to carry out modern scientific excavations here. The earlier excavations had literally been nothing more but shoveling out the contents of the ruins looking for gold. Gertrude Caton-Thompson was a different sort of person. I met her when she was in her 80s. She was a very strong-willed, powerful lady with impeccable manners. She was a classic late Victorian lady, but my goodness me, was she a good archaeologist. And she came here and excavated, not in the temple, which the great enclosure, which was well shoveled over, although she measured it and so on, but up here on the hill, at the top there, at the left-hand side of the hill there, there is a western enclosure. And this was where she excavated. Next, please. You can see it beautifully there in the air shot of the hill. The hill by Europeans is called the Acropolis or the hill ruin. It is a boulder-strewn granite copy hill, which has small spaces between the boulders, which became shrines. And this area here, where people lived, I think mainly ritual specialists, the western enclosure was the place where Gertrude Caton-Thompson was able to dig deep and discover the history of Zimbabwe. She did it and dated it using fragments of Chinese porcelain, finding numerous African pots, finding beads, and she roundly established, because of course you can date Chinese porcelain quite accurately, that Zimbabwe was built by people between about 13 and 1400 AD, not by the Queen of Sheba's subjects. In fact, in the classic monograph she wrote on Great Zimbabwe, which was a magnificent piece of work, she arrived here by ox cart, not in a car. There weren't any. She trekked in here. She was that tough. And she wrote in the acknowledgements and said at the end, and finally, I want to thank all those people with imaginative minds who wrote me letters saying that Zimbabwe was Phoenician. I have filed them in the file labeled insane, which was absolutely true. And she got into furious trouble, so much so that there was no more excavation at Zimbabwe until 1961. And these excavations were the first that brought radiocarbon dating to Zimbabwe, which showed very clearly that Zimbabwe was at its height between about AD 900 to 1400. And it's clear now from the study of local Shona tribe oral traditions that this was a very major center for rainmaking. And the rainmaking happened because a curious feature of the geography is that fogs from the Indian Ocean and drizzle come up from the Indian Ocean hundreds of miles away, excuse me, and bring moisture to the hill and to Zimbabwe. So it became a major center of rainmaking. And much of the power of these chiefs, these mutapas, was in fact in their power as rainmakers. Next, please. There's the western enclosure, and the area under the shelter there is where the great Gertrude Thompson Trench was. It went right down. They dug it again in 1956 and 1960 and found, well, that was where they got their carbon-14 samples, and this is what now is established as the chronology and widely accepted, except by racists who insist that the colonial belief was correct. And in fact, that was government policy right up on after the Declaration of Independence, was that Zimbabwe was justification for the independence of Rhodesia as a country, which of course now has all vanished. Very controversial. One of the few times when an archaeological site has really gone into international headlines. And on the right, you see one of the most remarkable pieces of sculpture at Zimbabwe, and that is a cult figure which shows a raven. These are thought to have been objects associated with the clans who ruled Zimbabwe. But Zimbabwe eventually pieced it out. Next, please. Pieced it out in about 1400, just before the Portuguese came. You get a magnificent view here of the great enclosure with its freestanding walls. Next, please. There's a fine view. There are two walls. You can walk them like this figure is here, and there is chevron decoration on the top, which had some form of ritual significance. It was here that the chief lived in isolation. Next, please. And inside is a remarkable structure. It's the conical tower. It's a solid structure of masonry. Gertrude Caton-Thompson tunneled under it to check it was solid. What it was, we don't know, but they suspect it is a depiction of a ritual grain bin. Next, please. Because in all these societies, the keeping of food surpluses, of grain, of cattle were of critical importance. Now let's look at the final chapter of this. Let's go to the middle Zambezi Valley. There is the Victoria Falls on top. And here is the middle Zambezi Valley, bounded on each side by 1,200-foot escarpments, a plateau above, temperatures here very rarely go below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very hot, very humid in the rains. Never, ever go digging at 104 degrees humid heat, as I once had to do here. Next, please. And this was the middle Zambezi Valley. And here you see a very different sort of Africa, not freestanding ruins, but subsistence farmers living by the Zambezi, which is on the other side of those hills. And you can see they lived in places where the winds would blow, they lived under shelters like that, moving with the shadows, and the wind would blow through. Very temporary. They would live there maybe 15 years, and then the village would move when the land around, which was cultivated with slash and burn, became exhausted. Next, please. And in 1960, here at a place called Ngombe, the place where the cow sleeps, and the river is here, was where they found spectacular traces of Middle Zambezi trade, dating to about AD 1480, which was just about when Portuguese became aware of the interior. Here's a couple of views, lots of elephants. Next, please. There is Ngombe. In 1960, the colonial authorities decided to build a pumping station here to bring water up from the Zambezi, which is about 3/4 of a mile away. And when they dug the foundations up here, they found extraordinary burials. Next, please. The burials of 9 people, of whom this is the most important man. He was a man in his late 20s. And you may remember that I told you about conus shells as symbols of wealth and power. This gentleman had 9 of them round his neck, and the one here with the arrow had a gold backing plate. He wore brass bangles made of wire on his limbs, and the bangles preserved traces of textile, Indian textiles. Above his head were a series of tools which were used for drawing and making the wire from copper ingots. There is the wire. And around his neck were strings of 18-karat gold. And at his waist was an amulet, which an expert told us is an Islamic amulet and rather unusual. This gentleman was clearly a powerful man. Some of the other people with him were equally well decorated and adorned. They were traders. They were known, it turns out, from all the traditions as Chikunda. And they lived among the people, they traded, and apparently a group of them here died, all of them about the same time as far as we can tell. Down at the edge of the site, and this is where I got involved, we found the traces of a large number of burials, over 90% of them of children less than a year old. This must have been a very, very horrible environment to live in. Next, please. I never want to go back. And then, of course, came the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama himself came round the Cape, sailed up to where Mombasa is, and then a pilot took him across to India. And this, of course, is when the whole colonial history began. The Portuguese recorded a chief called Mwene Mukapa, who was living in Zimbabwe, and they rapidly took over the trade. And the ancient trade of gold and ivory and valuables in the Indian Ocean rapidly vanished. What did not vanish right until the 1930s was the trade in mango poles up here, textiles, ivory. Why is ivory so important? Because African elephant ivory is easier to carve than that of the Indian elephant is too brittle. So there was a very quick one, excuse me, run through the trade of the Erythraean Sea. It is absolutely fascinating to go and become an expert on it. You really have to learn fluent Arabic, among other things, but it is really fascinating. And what is really important is that the area along the East African coast was controlled not by Islamic Arabs, although they lived there, but by people who perhaps had a nominal loyalty to Islam, but in fact were Africans who traded extensively with people with whom they had personal connections in the far interior. This, even today, is one of the frontiers of archaeological research, and it is an area where not enough overseas archaeologists spend time. Next, please. And on behalf of my Maine coon cat, Atticus caticus catamor moose, I say thank you, and I hope I haven't sent you to sleep.
Thank you very much, Brian.
He's smiling. I'm in good shape.
Yeah, it's probably really the first time I've heard analysis of some archaeological area told as a story. So this was really interesting. Thank you for it. If anyone would have any questions, don't hesitate to put them write them down in the chat, or raise your hand and you will give a chance to ask it. But I would like to say that we have only 10 minutes to finish this meeting. So
if I may just say one other thing. I think it's important to realize the achievement of the people who first started digging here. When I first went to Africa, there were 9 archaeologists between each, excluding Egypt and the Sudan, between there and Cape Town, including West Africa. We really were alone, and my predecessors were even more alone. And the magnitude of what they did, people like Leakey and Desmond Clark, is truly extraordinary. What we did was following up on their work, and what people are doing now is, of course, building on us. But it really shows that archaeology is a cumulative enterprise. I've said enough.
Yeah, it indeed is. James, it seems you have a question.
Hello, James.
Quick. Hello. I did try and type questions the other week, but then I deleted them last with an unfortunate keystroke, so I thought, won't try that again. Just a quick question, really. The stone towns you mentioned on the coast, which were the destination of the traders from Arabia, India, has there been much archaeology in those locations?
There's been a great deal, and it was begun by 2 people, James Kirkman and Neville Chittick. They were both very sound archaeologists. Neville Chittick worked mainly at Kilwa and Kirkland at Mombasa. But there is a great deal being done. There's a man at Bristol called Mark Horton who's done marvelous work. There's a lady up in York who is extremely good too. So there are people working on it. And of course, Africans are working on it. So it's very active and fascinating. But you need Arabic.
Thank you.
All right. I wanted to ask, you mentioned some of the commodities that were traded over the Indian Ocean. So do we know how the volume of these trade exchanges was like developing and changing over the centuries, and how it was like shaping and changing the society and the settlements in Africa especially?
We don't know a great deal about the volume of the trade because a lot of it was just hand to hand. Gold, they have some estimates of the number of ounces of gold removed. I forget what it is, but it's pretty substantial. The main one, commodities, though, one of the big ones was ivory, because of its enormous value in India. We have no idea how much it did, but the impact of the trade, both in India and also in Africa, was enormous. And the influence of the East African coast in the early days was when gold went up to Egypt, and that was very powerful.
Right. So, is there any chance that the trade of the gold would start causing inflation of the value at some point, or that wasn't really a case? Because I can imagine that
the trade was mainly in ornaments.
Hmm.
And there was a legendary story, which is true, I think, of the king of Mali from West Africa, who went across and visited Cairo in medieval times, and he left so much gold there that the price of gold in India went down by 10%. At least that's the story. Now, it was a major trade, major trade.
All right, thank you. You also mentioned how Gertrude Thompson came with this dating based on the Chinese porcelain. How did she receive some kind of support from other archaeologists for her opinion from the field, or was it like so controversial that no one would stood up?
No. It was very British. A great deal of the argument was behind closed doors. There was a famous archaeologist in South Africa, Raymond Dart, who discovered Australopithecus, the early hominin. He was violently against Caton-Thompson, and it got hard for her to speak at meetings, so she just walked away from it and became an extremely eminent Stone Age archaeologist. She did a lot of work in Egypt, cargo races, for example. But Zimbabwe was one of her last projects, as far as I can recall. We didn't tangle with Gertrude. She was a tough person, and she stood no nonsense. And by God, has history shown her right. She was the sort of standard of archaeologists that Africa at the time badly needed. And she wasn't asked back. It's a great pity because she was really good. But the great thing about her was she wasn't fixated on settlers. She had a sense of the medieval world, a sense of imported porcelain. She knew who to talk about Chinese porcelain. And she worked with African workers and one other European woman. She was amazing, tough as nails. I had a wonderful tea with her when she was elderly, and I sat bolt upright in my chair and she sat in hers, and we had tea in cups and saucers and talked. And her mind was like a razor. She was questioning me because I was working on the Iron Age at the time. She zeroed in on me, and I had to really come back at me, but she seemed to like me. We got on. I liked her.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, one of the things about being a late career archaeologist is that in a way you're walking history, because I mean, I knew Leakey well. I knew, all these people, and people look at you as if you're a fossil.
All right. I think we will have to leave it there, even though I have some other questions, but the time is really pressing us. Thank you very much, Brian, for accepting our invitation. It was a great pleasure to have you and to listen to your talk. So hopefully sometime in the future, you will be willing again to give us some update on some topics you will be researching next.
Good, my pleasure.
All right, thank you very much.
Have a good day. Goodbye.
Have a nice rest of the day.
Oh, it's Christmas coming, isn't it? Yes, I will. Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.